In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Eochaid Executioner build. This is a level 150 Arcane Strength build that uses the Marais Executioner's Sword. At first glance, this might seem like an odd choice of a combination because there isn't a ton of synergy between Strength and Arcane. There isn't like a seal or a staff that scales with both of these, and if you're playing a hybrid character, generally the stat that you want to pump for your spell casting is also the stat you want to pump for your weapon, but in this case you're pumping Strength, which just doesn't benefit spellcasting unless you're using the Claw Mark Seal, in which case Arcane does nothing. And then if you're using the Dragon Communion Seal, Arcane benefits it, but Strength doesn't. And, as far as staffs, you have a similar situation. So there really isn't a lot of synergy here at first glance. However, this weapon skill absolutely slaps. Eochaid's Dancing Blade sort of charges your sword forward, it spins it like a corkscrew, and it deals damage, and then you grab it and slash, not unlike the boss who uses the same skill against you. But what's really interesting about this is that the damage that it deals isn't based off base damage and weapon scaling, but instead your total attack power. So by increasing your total attack power, you automatically increase the damage of this skill. There are an absurd amount of ways to increase your attack power in this game. You can use Lord of Blood's Exaltation if you set something bleeding or yourself bleeding. You can use the Lord of Rod's Exaltation. You can use Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or Sword Insignia. You can use Millicent's Prosthesis. You can use, Ritual Sword Talisman. There are tons of ways to increase your attack power, and each time you increase your attack power, this weapon's going to deal more and more damage. And it's because of this that we use the Marais Executioner Sword here. If you use the Regalia of Eochaid, you actually have less damage because the attack power of that weapon, even with all the scaling and everything added to it, will come out less because this weapon is a great sword and that weapon is a straight sword. You can still use that weapon and still deal significant damage with this sort of setup, but you're not going to deal as much as you will with this weapon. However, maybe that's the way you want to play this build. Maybe you want to play that traditional straight sword and shield tank build, and you still want to have decent damage with your weapon skill, then this is a great way to do that. Just keep in mind that your stat spread will be a bit different. That weapon, the Regalia of Eochaid, scales predominantly with Dexterity and Arcane. However, the Arcane scaling is much, much better on that weapon than Dexterity. Past 20 points in Dexterity, it really starts to fall off, and you can actually do better, like all the way up to 80 Arcane than you basically can pumping Dexterity. So I recommend going really high on your Arcane. So if you want to use this weapon in a different build, maybe one that does use the Dragon Communion Seal or something like that, it's not a bad setup. However, the Marais Executioner Sword scales better with Strength than it does Arcane. That's why we stop Arcane at 50 and continue with Strength. So it's not as good of a setup if you want to use the Dragon Communion Seal for some spells or something like that. So that's why we do like a just all-out, warrior type build with this. But if you're going with the Regalia of Eochaid, you could probably do like a hybrid caster setup. Another good weapon pairing with this build is the Anspur Rapier if you make it like your secondary weapon in your right hand or something like that. And that's because, as I mentioned, the Eochaid's Dancing Blade damage increases with attack power. And because you can set, the poison status effect with this or Scarlet Rot status effect and maybe put poison on it or something like that, you can actually increase your attack power by using the Lord of Rot's Exaltation and using like the Mushroom Crown so that you get 30% increased attack power when you put poison on something. So if you start a fight, like a boss fight, probably not regular enemies, with, setting that poison status effect, then you get that increased attack power by 30% for 20 seconds. And that can make your, weapon ability deal even more damage. Keep in mind that it's hard to reapply this, so you're only going to get about 20 seconds worth, but you could still do that if you want. Additionally, you could put Bleeding on Anspur and use Lord of Blood's Exaltation, or you could use like a straight sword and put Seppuku on there in order to, set blood loss on yourself to get increased damage. There are a lot of ways you can buff your attack power, and this is just a good weapon to have. You don't need it all the time. Putting Scarlet Rot or Poison on a boss in combination with using this weapon skill is absolutely deadly. Beyond that, I'm using the Banished Knight Shield, and the reason for that is because it has relatively good guard boost when it's maxed out, and its equip load or weight is rather low. You could use a better shield with this build in terms of strength requirements, one that blocks a lot more, has higher guard boost, but your equip load will skyrocket significantly, so you'll have to put a lot more points in endurance, which is totally up to you. You can absolutely do that, and it's probably not a bad idea if you're someone who likes to block a lot. But the shield is kind of optional in this build. We're building around the sword, but if you want to use a shield, this is a good build to use a shield with, because you can just block with your left hand and then use L2 into like a really nasty weapon ability and just stagger an enemy and deal incredible damage. Or you can do a block counter if you want. When it comes to armor for this build, I'm using the chain set because it's not that heavy and gives me decent protection, but there are a lot of good helmets for this build, like the white mask that increases your attack power by 10% if you set bleeding or become, have the hemorrhage effect set on you, or the Mushroom Crown that does the same thing with poison, or, helmets that increase strength, or Arcane. There are a lot of good choices here, but I don't recommend using the Silver Tear Mask because that will actually lower your overall attack power, and that will lower the damage of Eochaid's Dancing Blade. When it comes to talismans for this build, I have Shard of Alexander, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, and Millicent's Prosthesis. And then in my fourth spot, I basically is like my flex spot. I will change this up depending what's going on. Sometimes I'll put the Green Turtle Talisman on there if I plan on blocking a lot, or sometimes I'll put Godfrey Icon on there if I know that I can get charged attacks of the skill off, because you can charge it up for increased damage and range, although it's kind of hard to do sometimes, so I don't advise putting it on all the time. Or if you're going for a bleed setup, you'll use Lord of Blood's Exaltation here, or if you're going for a poison setup, you'll use Kindred of Rot's Exaltation. Or if you're just, moving around on the landscape and you're not really using any of those, you might use Ancestor's Spirit Horn here in order to reclaim 3 FP every time you kill an enemy. One cast of this usually kills an enemy, the Dancing Blade ability. And if you use the Carrion Filigree Crest, you only reduce the cost by 3 anyway. So you're basically getting the same amount from the Ancestor's Spirit Horn as you are from Carrion Filigree Crest. And that way with Ancestor Spirit Horn, you get the FP when you kill the enemy anyway. Like, it doesn't matter how many, if you kill it with a jump attack or something like that, you'll still get the FP. So Shard of Alexander just boosts the damage of this ability by 15%, which is great. We need that damage increase to make it slap hard. So Rotten Wing Sword Insignia and Millicent's Prosthesis work together so that as you hit an enemy rapidly, your attack power increases and increases and increases. And because the corkscrew attack of Eochaid's Dancing Blade counts as an attack, the more times you hit, the more damage you do. So what you're going to find with this is that when you start using the ability, the first hits are going to do very little damage, but quickly the damage is going to ramp up until the end of the combo hits like a truck. So if you can't pull off the whole combo before you get staggered out of it, the damage is going to be meager. But if you can get the whole chain pulled off, it's going to hit very, very hard. Somewhere around 4,000 to 6,000 damage in most cases if you can pull the whole thing off. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, that you can charge this to deal increased damage, and that's one of the reasons you can use Godfrey Icon, is that you can get an extra 15% damage when you hold down L2 in order to make it have increased range and damage, which is fantastic. It's harder to do. You can't really pull this off in some boss fights. But sometimes, like enemies that are aggressive, you can start charging it early, and then they'll run right into the tip of it, and it'll deal increased damage because it has been charged up, which is fantastic. So the way this build generally plays is that as you're running around on the landscape and you run into a pack of enemies, the first thing you're going to want to do is try and kill one with Eochaid's Dancing Blade. This is because, Millicent's Prosthesis and Rotten Wing Sword Insignia are going to trigger when you do that, increasing your attack power. So even your regular attacks after that point are going to hit harder, and any Eochaid's Dancing Blades you do on other enemies will attack harder from that point, like at the very beginning of the attack chain instead of the end, which is great. I usually just go around and nuke everything with this ability if possible. It usually staggers most enemies. And one upside that this weapon has over the Regalia of Eochaid is that it has longer range. Sometimes the Regalia just misses a couple hits, or the last hit misses because enemies kind of get pushed back a little bit. And that doesn't seem to happen as much with this weapon, which is, good. So with bosses, you basically have 2 strategies. You can try and block if you're using a shield and do some block counters and stagger them, and then go for like a charge, Eochaid's Dancing Blade, or try and hit them with a couple. Or you can try and like dodge and block them until you have an opening to use it. Learning the timing of bosses is really important in some cases in order to, pull this off. Not every boss can you just walk up to and spam this ability and melt them. Like Godskin Duo you probably can, and a couple other bosses you can. But not everyone is that way, and finding the opening to use this ability to get massive, massive damage is important, because as I mentioned, the further into that ability it goes, the more damage you're going to do, so you don't want to get interrupted midway. Another thing that I like about the Marais Executioner's Sword as well is that its R2 is a vertical slash. Sometimes you just have difficulty hitting enemies because they're above you if they're like flying, or maybe it's a big boss and its head is directly above you, and an R1 horizontal slash can't hit it, but an R2 vertical slash will get it, and that works really well. So for stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 25 Mind, 28 Endurance, 47 Strength, 20 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 15 Faith, and 50 Arcane. 40 Vigor is there to make sure that you can take a hit and keep on kicking. You're going to be wearing pretty decent armor with this, so that should be enough for you. Also, Vigor starts to decline a little bit after 40, so it's a good break point. We need stats in other places to make this build work, so we're going to go a little bit lower on the Vigor side for this build. 25 Mind is there to give you enough FP to use Eochaid's Dancing Blade regularly in between, checkpoints. Usually I only need like 1 or 2 blue flasks in order to get from checkpoint to checkpoint, even just spamming this on every enemy. So I think that's a really good spot. You could lower this a little bit and, have like an extra blue flask and put these points, like 5 points somewhere else if you want. 28 endurance is there because we're using a shield. I have a great sword equipped, and I have Anspur Rapier. But if you're not using Anspur Rapier, or maybe you decide to go with Regalia of Eochaid, this can be lower. It's good to have a lot of stamina for blocking, so if you're trying to make a block build, it's not bad to have a lot of stamina, but maybe you picked a heavier shield or something instead, and maybe you can drop a couple points down. However, if you did pick a heavier shield, you might not be able to drop it down much, but this is going to fluctuate a little bit depending on the armor that you're wearing, the headpiece that you're wearing, and I like to try and keep it so it's just exactly enough to be able to medium roll, and if you're in a block build, you'll probably want a little more anyway, so that's where I like to keep it. We have 47 strength here and 50 arcane. Arcane dips off heavily after 50, so I don't recommend going any higher than 50, and if you want to keep progressing this build, keep increasing strength. Strength outperforms arcane in terms of overall damage, particularly lower than like 45-ish. So it's going to do better just in general. So don't if you're earlier in the game and you're trying to put this build together, prioritize strength and then increase arcane, after you get your strength up to about 45-ish. You're not using any spells or abilities with this build unless you decide to go with the Regalia and use the Dragon Communion Seal, then you could. But otherwise, there's no reason to pump Arcane first. When it comes to Dexterity, the value there is actually 15. I have Millicent's Prosthesis, which gives me +5, but that's there to meet the requirements for Anspur Rapier. Otherwise, you don't really need Dexterity for this build. I believe the Regalia has a requirement of 18 Dexterity, so if you're using that, you'll need 18 total between that and the Prosthesis. And if you're playing with just the Marais Executioner's Sword, you will need even lower than that. I think it's only 14. So this will fluctuate a little bit depending on how your build setup is. And we don't need any intelligence, and really you don't need any faith for this build. The reason I have 15 here is that I'm playing a Confessor and I had 14 already. I can use one more point, and then I can use Flame Grant Me Strength to increase my damage by 20%. The weapon skill is actually predominantly physical damage. I'd say it's 80 to 85% physical damage, and the rest is magic damage, so you get a significant boost from Flame Grant Me Strength, and it'll also boost your regular attacks as well. There are seals that weigh 0 equip weight, so you can just throw one on. You don't even need to upgrade it if you want to buff with this as well. And one last tip before I wrap up this video. If you're using the Flask of Wonders Physique, I highly recommend using the Thorny Crack tier. This is going to increase your attack power for successive hits, not unlike Millicent's Prosthesis or the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, so this just adds to that even further. And I also like to use the one that regenerates stamina, but if you want to get max damage instead of stamina regeneration, you could also put strength here, because you'll get significant more points into strength, boost it by 10, and that's all going to go into your attack power, which will further boost the damage of this weapon. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring build guides as we make a level 150 builds. If you have builds you want to see, let us know in the comments below.